Hello, AP Macro students. I'm Mr. Sanabria, and welcome to part 2 of the aggregate model, where we will go ahead and talk about shifting aggregate demand. And before we get started on that, let's spend a moment for me to really emphasize the importance of aggregate demand and shifting aggregate demand. Here's the bottom line. Macroeconomists have recognized that the shifting left and right of aggregate demand is the business cycle. Okay, so if macroeconomics exists to counter the business cycle, which is what I've been kind of telling you this whole time, then identifying this one thing, this shifting back and forth of aggregate demand as the business cycle, is incredibly important. Most of the things that we do in this course, when it comes to counter-cyclical policies, and those actions taken by political leaders or leadership of the central bank in order to improve the health of the economy, those are all targeted at aggregate demand. Why? Because aggregate demand is the business cycle. So the very thing that we're trying to counter is aggregate demand. And so let's take a moment, and I've actually made some very elaborate props today. I'm very pleased with this. Check this out. We've got the aggregate model, but missing from this is aggregate demand, right? So we've got everything here that's going to be stationary today. So we've got price level, we've got long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply just kind of sitting there, and we've got full employment at long-run aggregate supply. As you'll recall, that's where long-run aggregate supply exists, and then real GDP. And then here I've got my aggregate demand curve. Okay, so there's aggregate demand. And what we can notice is that this can go back and forth. And that's what we're talking about today. So what I'm doing right now is I'm simulating the business cycle. This is long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Aggregate demand crosses aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, at the same place as long-run aggregate supply. As we move through the business cycle and we get to a peak, remember peaks have inflation. Well, there's that inflationary gap. So here we are at an inflationary gap, and then we end up going into a contraction. And as we go to a contraction, we pass back down, GDP is declining, we're now in a recession. Here's your recessionary gap. We hit the trough, and we start to recover, we're recovering, we've reached full employment, 5% unemployment, and now we're going beyond. That bubble is forming, and now we have another inflationary gap. And the business cycle continues back and forth just like this. And if we can think about that, and let me straighten myself out here. If we can think about this, then a lot of things are going to come together. This is the business cycle. So what do you think policymakers want to do whenever there's inflation like this? They want to slow down the economy. And the way they do it is they decrease aggregate demand. They're trying to pull it back here. If we're in a recession, what are policymakers wanting to do? Well, they want us to get back to long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. That's always the goal. So how can we achieve this? Let's increase aggregate demand. Let's push it back where we want it to be. So that's what's going on here. And the other thing I want to remind you about before we get into this is our production possibilities model. And I've gone ahead and cleaned it up from the last video, so it's labeled properly and you can see things more clearly. This A prime, and B, these are representative of the business cycle as well. We are at full employment here. We're at long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. B has that recessionary gap, and A has that inflationary gap. So we can, and we should, in our minds, we should be thinking of the way that these two models are linked, and we should be really emphasizing and understanding that the things that shift aggregate demand are incredibly important to us. And the good news about what shifts aggregate demand is that it's something we already know. Aggregate demand, the determinants of it is SIGEX, right? Consumption spending, investment, government spending, and net exports. Those are your 4 determinants of aggregate demand. And so now perhaps we're starting to see why anytime we've talked about any of those 4 things, we put so much emphasis on it. We talked about Forex already, and I said that where the College Board wants you to go with thinking about Forex is to be able to make that association between if a currency appreciates, then net exports decreases. Why was that such an important idea? Why was that the assumption they wanted you to make? Well, because now we know that net exports is one of the 4 determinants of aggregate demand. It's one of the things you could attack if you wanted to counter the business cycle. This is the thought process. This is what I want you to be thinking about this whole time. We're going to spend today basically taking another look at SIGEX, because those are the 4 things that determine where aggregate demand is. So if those 4 things aren't going well, and what I mean to say, and I'll go ahead and be more clear now, if the 4 possible types of expenditure are decreasing, then you're going to see a decrease in aggregate demand. But if you can increase any one or combination of those 4 expenditures, consumption spending is consumer expenditures, right? Gross private investment, the expenditures by firms, government spending, expenditure by the government, or net exports, the combined expenditure with our imports and exports. If those go poorly or decrease, that's recessionary. If those heat up too much and there's too much expenditure, that's inflationary. So where we're going with this is, what can we then do as policymakers and bankers to manipulate aggregate demand back to macroeconomic equilibrium, right where we want it? And that would be countering the business cycle. So that's really that captures what we're trying to accomplish here. So let's go ahead and take our notes, really with that understanding framing the way we look at all of this. Okay? So the first thing I want you to know is that there's 2 parts to any shift in aggregate demand. Okay? What we're going to talk about are the things that we do to cause aggregate demand to shift. Okay? Or they could be inadvertent things. But whatever happens, we're talking about a change in spending. That's how aggregate demand shifts, right? Because we are demanding stuff. And our demand is represented by our spending. Who's spending? Consumers, businesses, the government, the rest of the world. So, considering this spending, there is some change in the behavior of SIGEX, of consumers, businesses, government, or the rest of the world. So that's part 1, okay, that change in behavior. And part 1 here is what we're going to emphasize today. Today we're talking about what kind of things would change the behavior of consumers, businesses, the government, or the rest of the world. The second part of any of these shifts is a multiplier effect that produces a greater change than the original change. Okay? So you have the thing, and you could think of it scientifically as a catalyst for change, and then there's this multiplier effect that makes that change bigger. Today we're not going to worry about the multiplier effect. I want you to be aware of it now. I'm going to refer back to this slide in a couple of lessons and say, hey, remember that multiplier effect? Well, now we're going to learn it. But for today, we're just focusing on changes in SIGEX. And I'm going to say changes in SIGEX a lot. So I probably will no longer be going back and emphasizing that a change in SIGEX means a change in consumer behavior, business investment, the government spending, or net exports. Okay, I'll just be saying changes in SIGEX from now on. Okay, just a quick note, even though I'm sure you've already picked up on it, aggregate demand shifts the same way that every other curve we have, right? An increase is to the right, a decrease is to the left. And let me just illustrate that for you real quick. Here we are at equilibrium. An increase in aggregate demand is a move to the right. We've created an inflationary gap. A decrease in aggregate demand is a shift to the left. We've created a recessionary gap. So bear that in mind. It shifts the same way that we're used to. So let's continue. Okay, so the determinants of aggregate demand, the things that determine where aggregate demand is drawn on the graph, I've already told you. It's SIGEX, consumption spending. gross private investment, government spending, and net exports, which is exports minus imports. And remember, this is historically for the United States since World War II, this has always been a negative number. Okay? But what we're looking for is relative change, right? If that number is, the number's always going to be negative, right? But if that number gets more negative, then that's going to put a leftward shift to aggregate demand. If that number becomes less negative, that's a rightward shift in aggregate demand. So don't think that aggregate demand won't shift right because of a change in net exports until you've reached positive net exports. That's not what's being said at all. What we're saying is whatever relative change. So if it went from negative 1 billion to negative 500 million, that's a huge rightward shift in aggregate demand. So let's go through these components of SIGEX one by one and just kind of talk through some of the things that might change that behavior. Starting with consumption spending. Remember, consumption spending is about 70% of GDP. That makes consumption spending enormously important to policymakers, right? The changes in behavior of the American consumer has a huge impact on where aggregate demand is. So if we stop spending money, well, we're going to be a big cause of a recession in a lot of ways, right? Now, we don't just decide to stop spending money, so there's probably a lot of other economic conditions in place that would cause us to stop spending as much money. However, that consumption spending is an enormous part of where aggregate demand is put. And this is the reason why the news and the economists focus so much on consumer behavior. How strong is American consumption? So, things that would affect our spending, well, our wealth, right? If the stock market surges and people are feeling more wealthy, then we're going to increase our spending patterns. Okay, more wealth equals more spending, and that's a rightward shift in aggregate demand. Less wealth is less spending, and that's a leftward shift. Pretty straightforward there. Okay. Our expectations. Remember a while ago when we were learning about supply and demand, this was one of the determinants, and I said, hey, if you think that gas prices are going to go down, you're not going to demand today, right? You're going to wait till tomorrow and demand then. Well, the same thing works at the aggregate level. So this is more of a general feeling, right? If consumers are positive about where the economy is going and they feel like they're going to continue to be financially stable, then demand will pick up. People won't mind spending a little more. They won't kick back as much into saving and for maybe some sort of a rainy day fund because they feel good about where the economy is going. And we're talking about really big kind of just general feeling of the American people, right? Individual circumstances will always differ, but we're not talking about microeconomics. We're talking about macroeconomics, and so we're trying to capture the general feeling of the population. So if people are generally more wealthy, spending aggregate demand will go up, right? If people are generally positive about the economy and where things are headed, then aggregate demand is going to increase because consumption spending will increase. And negative expectations will have the opposite effect. We think that, hey, oh man, I think there's some sort of big recession coming. I probably should save. I should kick back some for that because, I got to weather the storm. If that's generally the attitude, that's going to cause a leftward shift in aggregate demand. We're going to continue now with consumption. Okay? Household spending is affected by debt. Okay? Less debt equals more spending. Hey, if I'm not paying off a debt, then I can consume more. More debt equals less spending. This is why economists are beginning to get a little concerned with the amount of student loan debt that the American consumer is, saddled with. Would be a way of putting it. Okay, all of this student loan debt that the typical American family has does cause them to consume less, and so that hurts consumption spending, which ends up shifting aggregate demand to the left. And then finally, taxes. Okay, we're going to spend a lot of time on this in the future. So for right now, let's just say less taxes equals more spending, rightward shift, more taxes, less spending, leftward shift. All right, so let's continue now with gross private investment. We already talked about consumption. Let's talk about gross private investment, the next component of SIG-X, the next determinant of aggregate demand, and that is I with a subscript of G, and it is investment spending, and it's sensitive to real interest rates. This is our main thing. The main thing that we want to talk about that would change gross private investment is a change in real interest rates. Now in the future we're going to talk all about why interest rates might change, but for now let's just say, okay, if interest rates change, then that's going to affect gross private investment in this way. Okay, so a lower real interest rate equals more investment. And let me real quick actually explain what real interest rates are, just in case we're not as familiar with that as we could be. The interest that you pay, or what an interest rate is how much it costs to borrow money. Okay? So interest is the cost of borrowing money. And I also need you to understand that it's an equivalent statement, or a symmetrical statement, or means the same thing, to say it's the profit from lending money. It just depends on who you are, right? If I'm the bank, I look at interest as the profit I make from lending. And if I borrow money from the bank, which is probably what most of us are more familiar with, the interest rate is the cost of borrowing that money. And so this ends up making perfect sense, right? If the cost of borrowing, or a low interest rate, is going to result in more investment, that's because it's now cheaper to invest. And so all you have is really a regular kind of supply and demand function going on here. And I'll go ahead and move myself out of the way so you can see that the opposite is true. High interest rates are going to equal less investment, and if there's less investment, then one of the components of SIG-X has decreased in value, and the whole demand curve shifts to the left. We're going to continue now with gross private investment. Okay? Investment spending is sensitive to the expected rate of return. Okay? If you expect a high rate of return on an investment, then you would be willing to pay a little more for it, right? Or if you're not expecting a big rate of return, you're not going to take that investment unless you can pay a little less for it. Okay, so you end up with this idea of expected rate of return, and this is some other concept that we're going to return to. And we're going to look specifically at this idea of expected rate of returns, how that interacts with interest rates, and that's called the investment demand curve. And it's something we'll be doing here in a couple of lessons. Okay, what influences expected rates of return? Well, I'll go through this list quickly, but really what we're going to do is we're going to hold off on getting into these things until we do investment demand specifically. So expectations of future profits, technology, if there's some sort of technological innovation that is going to change your approach to investing, the degree of excess capital, right? Is there already a bunch of stuff you have that you're not using? Well, if that's the case, you're probably not going to invest very much. And then finally, business taxes. Business taxes are going to factor heavily into our thinking when we get into the things that the government does. Okay, so hold on to these things. We're going to talk more about them when it comes to thinking of aggregate supply as well as investment demand. Kind of different concepts. So now what we have is government spending, right? This is our third component of SIG-X. We've already talked about consumption spending. We've already talked about gross private investment, and now we're talking about government spending. And I'm actually not going to say very much at all about government spending. In fact, this is all I'm going to say for now. More government spending is an increase in G, right? And that's going to increase aggregate demand. Less government spending, decrease in G, and it's going to shift aggregate demand to the left. Why am I not saying much about government spending? Well, the reason is this. We're going to actually spend a lot of time talking about government spending in the future when we talk about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is government spending and taxing. And so what we're going to talk about is all these things and the way that the government can try to manipulate aggregate demand by changing its spending policies, and we'll talk about that in the future with fiscal policy. For now, just understand it's a direct relationship. And all of these are a direct relationship. By direct relationship, I mean if any component of sig x goes up, aggregate demand increases. If any component of sig x goes down, then aggregate demand decreases. And now finally, we have net exports. Remember that net exports is the difference between the value of imports and the value of exports, right? And we also know that this is consistently a negative number. That's what our trade deficit is. And what we're looking at are relative changes. What would make that negative number less negative, or what would make that negative number more negative, right? This is the same as an increase or a decrease. And so what's going to go ahead and determine or change the amount of net exports? Well, this we already know. Think way back to Forex. Remember how we started with Forex, and we know all about what's going to change exchange rates? Well, that's back in play now, and now we see why it's so important. Because net exports affects the business cycle. It affects the location of aggregate demand. So the exchange rates will affect net exports. A strong dollar equals more imports, fewer exports, aggregate demand shifts to the left, right? And we already made the conclusion. We know there's this negative relationship between net exports and appreciation and depreciation. Meaning, if the dollar appreciates, net exports goes down. Now we're making the next assumption, that is, okay, assumption number 1, dollar appreciates. Assumption number 2, net exports decreases. Assumption number 3, if net exports decreases, aggregate demand decreases. So we're just taking this to the next level. Relative income. Now we're really just talking about things that change exchange rates, right? A strong foreign economy equals more exports. Aggregate demand increases. Weak foreign economy equals less exports. Aggregate demand decreases. And that's our 4 determinants. So let's go ahead and summarize what we talked about today. A little shorter, right? Get myself out of the way. Aggregate demand reflects an inverse relationship between price level and real GDP. What we're talking about here is a negative relationship, a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And I'll bring out the model one more time so that we can take a look at it, right? Here is my model without my demand curve, and here is, doesn't go that way, goes that way. Here is my demand curve, and you can see that it's downward sloping. That's all we're saying. We're saying that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The next bullet point says that a change in price level creates real balance, interest rate, and foreign purchase effects that explain aggregate demand's downward slope. These are the 3 things we talked about in the last presentation that cause this downward slope, right? So go back and review those and make sure you understand those terms. The next bullet says changes in sig x cause a change in real GDP because they change aggregate demand. Okay, so let's illustrate that. A change in sig x causes our aggregate demand curve to shift back and forth. And what you notice is if you trace that equilibrium down to the x-axis, you're getting different real GDP, different real level of GDP. So here you're at optimal. Now we are in a recession, GDP is lower. Now we're inflationary and GDP is too high. An increase in aggregate demand means aggregate demand shifts to the right. A decrease in aggregate demand means that aggregate demand shifts to the left. And that is everything for the day. So we now know all about aggregate demand, and I cannot stress it enough, so I'm going to go ahead and say it again. Aggregate demand is the business cycle. And the things that manipulate aggregate demand, or the things that determine where aggregate demand is sig x. So anything that's not sig x doesn't affect aggregate demand, and there's actually relatively few of those things. They're going to be your aggregate supply determinants, which we'll talk about next time. But importantly, if you do see that something affects sig x, like the relationship we've discovered that Forex does ultimately affect net exports, and so that it affects aggregate demand, recognizing that is hugely important. Anything that affects consumption spending is important because of this. Anything that affects gross private investment is important because of this. Anything that affects government spending is important because of this, and of course net exports. So these are all important because they manipulate aggregate demand, and aggregate demand is the business cycle. So, until next time, happy studying.